What if I told you that the chains of colonialism weren't broken? They were simply rebranded as banks. For decades, they told Africa to trust the same system that stole our gold, that named our lands, that priced our people. And now, that same system has frozen our future. But one man, one soldier, one son of the soil, has stood up and said, no more. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did what few dared. He didn't write a speech. He didn't ask for permission. He simply acted. And in a single breath, he froze every Western bank account in Burkina Faso. It wasn't just policy, it was prophecy. A declaration that Africa will no longer beg at the feet of its oppressors. This isn't just Africa news. This is a turning point, a line in the red dust. And history will remember this moment, whether the world likes it or not. If you believe in freedom, in dignity, in the rise of a new Africa, then stay and subscribe, because what's coming next will shake the earth. It was not a war fought with bullets. It was not a speech shouted through megaphones. It was something quieter, more calculated. Yet its echo reverberated across every corner of Burkina Faso and beyond. One morning, the people woke up and found the banks closed, ATMs unresponsive, balances vanished, business halted. In a land already familiar with hardship, this was different. This was organized, deliberate, and complete. And when the news broke, it carried a single name: Captain Ibrahim Traoré. With a single executive order, Traoré had frozen every Western-controlled bank account operating in the country. No exceptions. French financial institutions, American development agencies, European NGOs, every account linked to a foreign power was blocked, overnight, quietly. Without debate. No press conference, no round table, no backdoor negotiations, just action, swift and unapologetic. The order, sources say, had been in preparation for weeks. Tensions had been rising behind the scenes, especially after international pressure mounted on Traoré's administration to shift its alliances, abandon regional military partnerships, and realign with traditional Western donors. But he had grown tired of veiled threats disguised as concern, tired of the financial chokehold that dictated policy from Paris and Brussels. In one private meeting, he reportedly said, "If we can't access our own money without permission, we are still slaves." And just like that, the decision was made. Not to request, not to negotiate, but to reclaim. This move was not simply economic. It was spiritual, symbolic. A nation that had long survived under the thumb of colonial currency, the CFA franc, tied directly to the French treasury, was finally drawing a red line. For years, development in Burkina Faso had been conditional. To build a hospital, one had to apply to the former colonizer. To improve education, approval was needed from distant capitals. To pay soldiers, to fund agriculture, to support basic infrastructure, the money had to pass through foreign institutions first. Sovereignty was never free. It had interest attached. And yet here stood a young captain, barely in his 30s, saying, "Enough." By freezing the Western accounts, Traoré was not simply disrupting the economy. He was rejecting an entire framework, one that allowed the West to hold African futures in offshore vaults, one that required African governments to answer to banks rather than to their people. This was the real coup, not the one that removed the previous government, but the one that removed foreign control from the nation's bloodstream. The fallout was immediate. French mining companies couldn't pay workers. International NGOs couldn't process payroll. Embassies scrambled. Investment firms panicked. Even local elites with savings in offshore accounts found themselves locked out. But perhaps most jarring of all was the effect on ordinary Burkinabe citizens, those who had, over time, stored their money in institutions linked to Western systems. Some were caught in the crossfire. Others saw it as sacrifice. "We are suffering," one market woman told local reporters, "but we are finally suffering for ourselves, not for them." Behind the boldness was careful strategy. Traore had anticipated the backlash. His administration had spent months quietly redirecting government reserves into state-controlled banks and setting up interim payment systems to cushion the internal blow. The move was not impulsive, it was revolutionary. "We cannot keep begging those who stole from us," Traore is quoted as saying in a leaked internal memo. "We must break the chain, even if it bleeds." And bleed it might. Analysts were quick to predict economic downturn, currency instability, and capital flight. Yet what many failed to grasp was that the captain was not aiming for comfort. He was aiming for control. In his view, if a nation must suffer, let it suffer by choice, not by decree. This was a spiritual stance as much as it was a financial one, a refusal to be governed by balance sheets drawn in colonial boardrooms. For those watching across the continent, the act was electric. From Accra to Kigali, headlines flashed. Social media ignited. Some hailed Traore as a liberator, a modern Sankara, reclaiming dignity through defiance. Others feared the consequences, warning that isolation and sanctions could follow. But one thing was certain. Burkina Faso had made a move that could not be ignored. This was no longer just Africa news. This was a signal. A crack in the foundation of how power has operated between Africa and the West for over a century. And in the stillness that followed the freeze, as officials scrambled and markets wobbled, a deeper question began to rise. If one country could shut the door, what if others followed? The answer to that question wouldn't take long. Because as the dust settled in Ouagadougou, murmurs were already emerging across the Sahel, and the world was watching, some in anger, some in awe. But inside Burkina Faso, the freeze was just the beginning. What came next would test not only the nation's economy, but its soul. The freeze fell like a hammer, sudden, blunt, and impossible to ignore. In the hours that followed Traore's announcement, the streets of Ouagadougou swelled with uncertainty. Not protest, not celebration, at least not yet, but something deeper, a silent reckoning. Mothers queued outside shuttered banks. Shopkeepers stared at empty tills. University students checked their scholarship portals in vain. There was no access, no explanation, just a nation holding its breath. Then, the murmurs began to shift. By the second day, frustration boiled over. In the central market, fights broke out over credit. In rural towns, word spread that salaries wouldn't arrive. Businesses started to collapse under the weight of paused transactions. Traders who depended on imports watched their supplies dwindle. And the question on every tongue was the same. What has our leader done? Inside ministries, pressure mounted. Cabinet members debated contingency plans behind closed doors. Advisors urged communication. Civil servants, unpaid and anxious, began whispering of revolt. To many within the administration, the freeze was a leap too far, righteous in vision but reckless in execution. Yet to others it was a moment long overdue, and they urged the captain not to waver. Tensions cracked along lines of class and allegiance. The elite, whose foreign accounts were now paralyzed, cried foul. But the working poor, long alienated from the reach of global banks, felt a strange pride begin to stir. On the third day, it came to a head. In the center of the capital, thousands gathered. Not to riot, but to ask, to demand answers. And as the sun beat down on the square, the silence broke. Some chanted in anger, others in support. The atmosphere pulsed with uncertainty. That afternoon, Traore appeared, not on a platform, not behind glass, but among the people. He walked without guards, without armor, just a microphone in one hand and conviction in the other. He did not apologize. Instead, he told the truth, his truth. "For too long," he said, "we have lived in a cage made of gold. They gave us aid, but never freedom. They gave us loans, but never control. And now they want to punish us for choosing ourselves." Let them. His voice did not rise. It rang. He spoke not as a president, but as a preacher. Not about policy, but about purpose. He acknowledged the suffering, the risk, the sacrifices, but he reminded them that chains are not always metal, and liberation is never painless. By the end of that speech, something had shifted. The crowd did not erupt into cheer. They did not march home with answers. But they stood still, united, listening. And in that stillness, a new kind of clarity emerged. That perhaps this suffering was not chaos. It was the cost of courage. Of course, not everyone agreed. Across the country, discontent festered. In the north, protests turned violent. In the east, police clashed with demonstrators. A small faction within the military reportedly voiced dissent. Rumors of a counter-coup surfaced, though no evidence confirmed it. But what is clear is that Burkina Faso was being pulled at the seams, not by Traoré's hand alone, but by decades of dependence now being abruptly cut. Yet amidst the tension, pockets of resolve took root. Student groups held solidarity vigils. Clergy called for unity. Farmers pledged to keep feeding the nation even if foreign trade slowed. And for the first time in years, the national radio played music not dictated by foreign sponsors, but by Burkinabe artists, singing of hope and fire and home. Burkina Faso was hurting, but it was awake. And that awakening was not just political, it was spiritual. Across the region, people began to say, "We may suffer, but we are no longer silent." In this struggle, identity was being reforged, not as victims, not as clients of the West, but as architects of a future forged in fire. One local journalist captured it best in an article for Africa News. "This is not the collapse of a nation. This is the unlearning of dependence." And unlearning is always painful. But while the streets of Ouagadougou were learning to stand, the corridors of power abroad were preparing their reply. The IMF, the World Bank, the EU, and Washington were no longer watching. They were moving, and they did not come with understanding. What happens when the West's patience ends and pressure begins? Will Traoré bend, or will he break? In the weeks that followed the freeze, the air in Burkina Faso thickened, not with smoke or sirens, but with uncertainty. The decision that had stunned the world now began to show its weight at home. Markets, once bustling, slowed to a cautious crawl. Businesses operated on cash alone. Imports dried up. The supply chains that had quietly depended on Western intermediaries, banks, credit lines, logistics networks, began to fray. For the average citizen, the effects were immediate and personal. Lucy, a mother of 4 and owner of a small textile shop in Bobo Dioulasso, had imported fabrics from Ghana using a French-backed payment platform. Within days of the freeze, her orders were blocked, her inventory stalled, and her savings rendered inaccessible. She didn't care much for politics. But now politics had found her, and it was costing her business. "I believed in the captain," she said, "but now my shelves are empty, and hope doesn't pay the rent." Across the nation, stories like Lucy's piled up. School funds delayed, medical supplies stuck at border checkpoints. Fuel shortages created lines that stretched for blocks. Even state salaries began arriving late. The government scrambled to reroute payments through alternative networks. But years of dependency were not undone in a month. For a nation already on edge, the cracks in the system widened. And with each delay, each closed shop, each unpaid worker, the question grew louder. Was this the price of freedom or the cost of folly? Yet amid the hardship, something unexpected began to stir: solidarity. In cities and villages alike, communities adapted. Farmers organized barter systems. Youth groups offered delivery services by motorbike, bypassing broken digital systems. In some areas, churches and mosques became centers for aid distribution, feeding thousands without a single Western dollar. The resilience was not perfect, but it was powerful. In the absence of traditional stability, a different kind of strength emerged: interdependence without interference. Traoré himself remained firm. In a televised address, he acknowledged the suffering but reminded the people of the bigger picture. "They want us to believe we are falling," he said, "but we are planting, and planting is always slow and painful." He invoked not just economics, but identity. "We are not orphans, we are heirs, and we must learn to walk without a master's hand." His words resonated with many, especially the youth. For too long, they had watched their leaders sign agreements they did not understand, accept loans they could never repay, and parade in conferences where Africa was spoken about, never for. Now, for better or worse, their country was charting its own course, and even if that course was rough, it was theirs. Still, not all were convinced. The urban middle class in particular struggled to reconcile ideology with income. Many had built lives around access to global markets, international education, and foreign services. The freeze jeopardized not just their convenience, but their status. For them, Traoré's revolution felt less like empowerment and more like isolation. Internationally, the narrative was being shaped with speed and precision. Western outlets painted a picture of a reckless autocrat endangering his nation's future. Economic analysts predicted collapse. Diplomatic cables buzzed with warnings. Yet within Africa, the tone was different. In editorials, community radio broadcasts, and online forums, Traoré's name appeared not with mockery, but with respect. Some called him naive, others called him necessary, but all agreed he was doing something no one had dared before. A journalist, writing for Africa News, captured the moment well. "The West calls it chaos. We call it correction. Burkina Faso is not crumbling, it is cleansing." The line was shared widely across Francophone Africa, sparking debate in Mali, Niger, Guinea, and even Senegal. Was Traoré a fool or a forerunner? And so, Burkina Faso became more than a country. It became a mirror, a question, a warning, a hope. But hope is not immune to consequence. In global finance rooms and government halls, decisions were being made. Sanctions discussed, assets reviewed, aid withheld. The West would not take kindly to defiance, and they had the tools to make that known. Would they strike back with diplomacy or with dollars? With pressure or with punishment? The next chapter would not be written by speeches in Ouagadougou, but by quiet deals in Brussels, in Washington, in Paris. And the question now was how far they were willing to go to make Traoré kneel. From the polished corridors of Washington, D.C. to the grand meeting rooms of Brussels, the response to Burkina Faso's defiance was swift and revealing. Within days of Traoré's financial freeze, the United States Department of State issued a statement expressing grave concern over the deterioration of financial norms and the threat to regional stability. Behind the diplomatic language was a clear message: you've gone too far. France, predictably, reacted with fury. For them, the move was not merely provocative, it was personal. The CFA franc system, a legacy of colonial rule and monetary dependency, had long been defended as a pillar of regional stability. Now, with Traore not only criticizing it but dismantling it, Paris faced an existential threat to its influence in West Africa. Behind closed doors, French officials discussed economic retaliation, asset seizures, and coordinated sanctions. At the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, meetings took on a more strategic tone. Analysts spoke of regulatory non-compliance and financial unreliability. Aid reviews were suspended, investment risk ratings downgraded. In the language of global finance, Burkina Faso had gone from developing partner to financial pariah almost overnight. And yet, for all the noise, one thing stood out. The West was caught off guard. Traore had not waited for approval. He had not signaled his move. He acted on principle, not permission. And that, more than anything, shook the foundations of a system built on predictability. In the United States, mainstream media painted him as a dangerous radical. Burkina Faso veers toward economic collapse, read one headline. Traore's populism risks undoing years of development, warned another. But away from the newsrooms. Among the diaspora and African-American communities, the tone was far more conflicted. In churches, barbershops, and online forums, older voices remembered the likes of Lumumba and Nkrumah, men once called reckless, later remembered as revolutionary. Maybe, some whispered, we're witnessing something bigger than we think. In fact, several prominent Black American thinkers took to podcasts and op-eds to ask a bold question. Why does African independence always come with a price tag? And who's collecting the bill? Meanwhile, within the continent, the reaction continued to evolve. In an editorial for Africa News, a Ghanaian economist wrote, "What Traore has done may be unsustainable, but it is not unwise. It is a necessary discomfort." His words sparked reflection across Francophone and Anglophone Africa alike. Even leaders who disagreed with Traore's methods could no longer ignore the message. The status quo was cracking. As sanctions loomed and diplomatic ties frayed, Burkina Faso stood more isolated than ever, but also more visible. The world was watching, and the question now was no longer what Traore had done, but what the world would do about it. Would the West tighten its grip or be forced to loosen it? Would Africa kneel or stand together? The next move would determine not only the future of one country, but of a continent rediscovering its voice. As the dust settles and the headlines fade, a deeper truth remains. Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads. The freeze has exposed wounds long buried, economic dependency, political vulnerability, and the fragile dance between sovereignty and survival. Now the path forward is as uncertain as it is historic. One scenario looms ominously: economic retaliation. Sanctions already whispered in diplomatic circles could escalate. Aid might be halted, trade disrupted, investment blocked. For a nation still rebuilding its infrastructure, this could be devastating. Inflation may rise, jobs may vanish, and public patience, already stretched thin, may unravel. Yet there is another path: resistance through reinvention. Traore's government has already begun seeking alliances beyond traditional partners. Quiet dialogues are unfolding with emerging economies, Russia, China, even parts of the global South, nations willing to trade on new terms. It's not a perfect solution. But for a country seeking autonomy, imperfection is preferable to submission. Regional solidarity is also stirring. Mali, Niger, Guinea, all led by leaders tired of post-colonial puppetry, are watching closely. Some have begun exploring joint financial alternatives, regional banks, and independent currencies. If Burkina Faso holds the line, it may trigger not collapse, but coalition. Still, none of these futures are guaranteed. Much depends on the people, the farmers, the workers, the mothers, Like Lucy, who must choose every day whether to trust pain today in exchange for dignity tomorrow. It depends on whether youth will stay or flee, whether civil society will unite or fracture, whether Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, can maintain not just authority, but belief. And it depends on us, on those watching from near and far who must decide what we truly value in leadership. Is sovereignty a slogan or a sacrifice? Is freedom worth discomfort? Do we measure a leader's greatness by foreign applause or by the courage to walk alone? A South African pastor, reflecting on the crisis, said it best: Burkina Faso is not just fighting banks, it is fighting ghosts, the ghosts of empire, of silence, of shame. And those ghosts do not die easily. But history is rarely shaped by those who play it safe. So as the world debates and the nation struggles, one truth remains. This story is far from over. The freeze was just the first note in a new song, and the next verse will demand even more courage than the last. Because when you challenge the system always strikes back. But this time, Africa may just be ready to strike forward. This is not just the story of a nation freezing foreign bank accounts. It is the story of a people thawing out from decades of economic captivity. What Captain Ibrahim Traoré did was more than a policy shift. It was a declaration, a spiritual defiance against the quiet violence of dependency. And whether history records it as triumph or tragedy, Burkina Faso Ibrahim Traoré has forced the world to reckon with a question it long avoided. What does true sovereignty cost, and who is willing to pay for it? In the boardrooms of the West, they speak of risk, instability, and rebellion. But here, in the hearts of those who have lived under the weight of inherited chains, it feels different. It feels like awakening. Like dignity, like home. Yes, the road ahead is hard. There will be mistakes, there will be hunger, there will be fear, but there will also be pride. The kind of pride that can't be measured in GDP, but in the strength of a nation standing, shaking, but unbent. If you followed this far, I invite you to think not just with your mind, but with your memory. Remember where your people came from. Remember what was taken. Remember what was never returned. And ask yourself, what would you do if your dignity depended on defiance? Because this isn't just Africa news. This is Africa choosing itself. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of something we've lost, don't scroll past it. Share it. Speak on it. Let the world know we're paying attention. Let our leaders know that silence is no longer acceptable. That sovereignty is not negotiable. Subscribe now, not just to this channel, but to a new kind of consciousness, one rooted in truth, in courage, and in the fire of self-determination. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Should Burkina Faso stand firm or seek compromise? Do you believe more African nations will follow Traoré's path? Let's not wait for the headlines. Let's become the story. Because what's happening isn't just news. It's the beginning of a new Africa. And the world needs to hear it. Twice, this is Africa news. And this is just the beginning.